When we think about formative and summative assessments, it can be one of the more misunderstood relationships in assessment literacy. Today, I want to really focus in on what I've learned from Rick Stiggins in this area, because when I was first trained in what formative assessments were and summative assessments were, I really thought it was the kind of thing where a summative assessment was my test, and so the formative assessments were my quizzes. And I would give lots of quizzes, and I would average those into a solid grade that would maybe even be equivalent to my test grade. And in my mind, that's what formative assessment was. Or the fact that I gave the feedback from the quizzes along the way to the students. Come to find out, I was misunderstanding formative assessments. And so I really focused in on the work of Rick Stiggins. And with his help, I've been able to really understand why formative assessments are such a buzzword. Why everyone says, oh, do you have your formative assessments? Well, the fact is, formative assessments done correctly, a way that results in giving descriptive feedback back to students in time for them to improve their performance. When formative assessments are done the way Rick Stiggins has talked about it, the results in classrooms of 35 to 40 students rivals one-to-one tutoring. That's why it's such a buzzword. That's why everyone wants to have it. But if we're not trained in what it really is or what it isn't, then we might be doing maybe a summative assessment hybrid. It's actually not formative assessments, and so we're not going to get those kinds of results. So I'd like to share with you now just an overview of the relationship between formative assessments and summative assessments and what they are and what they aren't. So to start off, formative assessments can be described as for the learning process. And that's really what they are. Formative assessments are assessments that are to promote learning. So they are for learning. And summative assessments are of the learning. They are really focused on, did the students get what I was teaching? So summative assessments happen at the end of the instructional experience. Okay, their purpose is to find out information or data of the learning. Did the students get it? So they are the autopsy. Okay, formative assessments, being for the learning process, are done during the instructional experience. So they are something that I would picture returning to again and again as the learner is going through the process. Summative at the end of the learning experience. So the product of a summative learning experience is a grade. Okay, its purpose is to sort students, to give meaningful grades about the end product. So often the summative assessment would be used by a teacher or an administrator or by parents or by greater society. The primary user of a summative assessment is really in that teacher mode. Whereas a formative assessment, or for the learning process, the primary user of the product is the learner. And if it's not the learner, then I'm in some sort of hybrid of a summative. The primary user of formative assessments are the learners, because they need to use that descriptive feedback that they get to improve their performance. Now, a teacher might also use a formative assessment, but not dominantly. It's the student. Okay? So in that sense, the product that comes out of a formative assessment is a learning plan, something that a student can use to improve their performance, not graded. Okay? So in terms of that, I get descriptive feedback with a formative assessment and evaluative feedback with a summative assessment. That means my feedback comes in different forms. The feedback form for a summative assessment is about what we're learning. So the feedback is, I got 20% of my science standards met. Okay, so it's all about what I was trying to learn. I got a B on my math test. Okay, the feedback form for formative assessment has 2 levels. Part of it is about what. All right, I absolutely find out I got 20% of my science standards met. But I also equally get feedback about my learning strategy. What method was I using for learning this? What was my technique? So the student not only gets feedback on, well, you learned 5 of your spelling words, but also that technique you were using to learn your spelling words. Did it work for you? Did it not work for you? All right, so we're going to talk about that. We can play that out. Because for a formative assessment to work, a student has to have known both the target right from the start of the learning experience, and they had to make a commitment to a learning strategy that they're going to use to meet the target. That way, when I assess them on the target partway through the learning experience, they have an opportunity to get feedback on how well are they doing on meeting the target, and how's that learning strategy working out for them. Which means a student gets feedback on not only what they're learning, but how they're learning at the exact same time. Well, hold on, you might say. That means I have to teach not only the math, but I have to overtly teach learning strategies. Yeah. And that's why formative assessments are so effective, because you are doing 2 things at once. You are not only teaching the students the what, whether you're teaching language arts or you're teaching social studies, but you're also teaching children how to learn. You're giving names to learning strategies. You're making them make a commitment to how they're going to learn the target, and then giving them opportunities to adjust based on how well they're doing. And then at the end, not only are they going to get information about what they've learned in terms of social studies, but they're going to walk away metacognitively aware, thinking about their learning and how they do it. That's why formative assessments rival one-to-one tutoring when they're done in classrooms. And they do take more time, but they're more effective. So this idea of 2 levels of feedback mean that when teachers are taking on this adjustment to doing formative assessments, we're going to have questions like, well, what are the names of learning strategies? Do we all call these learning strategies the same things? Are students aware that the learning strategies they use in one class would also be effective when trying to learn things in another class? And finally, students would even be in a position to start evaluating learning strategies. Which ones are their favorites? Which ones are not? And why? Once students can say, Miss, I know you've got those 3 learning strategies as options for how to learn to meet this target. Would it be okay if I did it this way? Now a student is being a self-navigator. They are identifying a learning strategy they want to use to show you that they can meet the target you have identified. Formative assessments are designed to create those opportunities so that children can co-create how they're going to learn it. They can evaluate their methods for learning things, and they can learn new methods for learning things from a professional educator, a teacher in the classroom. So formative assessments with that dualistic layer of not only going and giving feedback on what the child is supposed to learn, math, but how they're learning it, learning strategies, is an important distinction. And if you are not overtly teaching and assessing learning strategies, then we're not fully into that formative assessment design yet. The last piece of what happens with a formative assessment focuses on, because they're designed to celebrate learning, and because they're designed to support the learning process, they are for learning, then they absolutely identify what has been learned. And it's one of the dominant first steps of a formative assessment experience. What has been learned and how was it learned? And then we move into what still needs to be practiced and what has yet to be approached or learned. We really avoid the grading aspect there. Summative assessments by tradition in most school settings tend to master telling students what they didn't learn. We're very good at telling them what they don't know and what they still have to improve. And that's important. But when we are not good at telling students what they have learned, we run the risk of making it seem that all we care about is mistakes and what hasn't been mastered yet. And when we do that to a learner, we run the risk of having them also only hyper-examine the mistakes they've made and not celebrate and release the hormones in the brain that acknowledge what has been learned. Social emotional science has taught us this is very important because when students only hyper-focus on their mistakes, hormones are released in the brain that actually suppress long-term memory creation. So we want to make sure that in our formative assessments and summative assessments where possible, we celebrate the learning so that we can promote additional learning in the future. When working with formative and summative assessments, we get a lot of questions about, well, what is it supposed to look like? And what we found is it has a lot of different ways to look. So if I were to take a stereotypical test, okay, let's say a math test that has 30 problems, I could very easily transition it into a formative assessment by taking the test and showing the students what it's going to be right at the beginning of instruction and saying to the kids, okay, what strategies are we going to use to practice getting good at this test? It might be I'm going to try practice problems. It might be I'm going to talk through and explain my approach to these problems with my partner each day and check it off. And we're going to evaluate one another on our methodology. It might be I'm going to read the directions and make sure I know exactly what the questions are asking me and then try sample one, but do it slowly and deliberately. So I'm focusing on each step. These are all strategies for how to do well on such a test. Once the students are aware of what the target is, then they go through the course or the unit and they practice it. And then maybe halfway through we take the test. And the students have a graphic organizer separated into 4 parts. And the first part, they just put the number of each test item that they got correct when they took the practice test. And in the second one, if they made a simple mistake, if they made a basic error in addition and subtraction, let's say, they would put that number on the second box. And then the third box would be any of the items on the practice test that they took that they just completely got it wrong. They weren't in the right spot. They missed the standard, the point. Those items would go there. The fourth box would have an alignment to maybe the teacher has organized what we call responses. So if you got numbers 1 through 5 wrong, you would want to redo these homework assignments. And if you got numbers 6 through 10 wrong, you would want to do these homework assignments. And so now that the child has the information about what they got right and wrong, they can now self-navigate and go, all right, I choose these 2 activities to do, and I choose this activity to do. And they make a commitment in their learning plan. I am going to do these items to improve my performance on these numbers. That's an example of taking what you and I might call a typical or classical summative assessment and just transition it into a formative assessment design. Another option is to take what you and I would call a rubric, right? A regular, typical rubric nowadays, or what we call evaluative rubrics, because the original work in rubrics was actually descriptive. We've now changed rubrics to be evaluative. But let's say I have a 4-column rubric, all right, or a 5-column rubric, right? So no evidence, some evidence, partial evidence or basic evidence, strong evidence, exceptional evidence. There we go. I got my 5-part rubric. That's an evaluative rubric, and we've taken to using these with criteria and grading students, okay? So if I have an evaluative rubric, I might choose to take that evaluative rubric and create a formative form of it. Okay, so what does a formative form of it look like? I would give the students the same criteria, but only 2 columns. One is at standard, okay, and one is approaching or developing. So I'm not quite at the expectation, I'm at it. The rest of the rubric is blank. It's an annotated section for notes. And the reason why we do this is we say, okay, students, what's our strategy here? Our strategy that we're using here is a practice. You're going to write something, and we're going to use this rubric to give formative feedback on it. And I'm either going to say you are absolutely at the standard or not, but then I'm going to annotate your work. All right, I underlined your introductory sentence, or I say, I couldn't find your introductory sentence. Or we say, your introductory sentence was so amazing, it was publishable in the New York Times. So I don't need the exceptionally above or I couldn't find it columns. I'm not evaluating. I can annotate the work and give descriptive feedback to the student on exactly what I have found and what I need to find or what I'm looking for. If I do that, and then we say to the students, same thing. For these criteria, ways to practice it are, and I give them options, 3 or 4 steps that they could do to improve introductory sentences. If the student needed to focus on that, they commit and self-select those next steps to put into their graphic organizer. So I can take existing tests and rubrics and create formative versions of them so that students can work with them effectively and always be focusing on not only what they're trying to learn, but how they're going about strategically to learn it. And you're on your way.